Hey guys, I have something new to show you today. For some of you might be able to discern that this is a Bosch motor I have in my hands here, but it's a little bit different than maybe one you might be familiar with. Now, there was a motor introduced last year called the Bosch Generation 3 Performance Line motor, and this basically is that with a little change. But the Generation 3 motor system basically has this form factor. There's a couple different versions. There's the Active Line version. There's the Active Line Plus. The variance between those two primarily is just the amount of power. The Active Line has 40 Newton meters. The Active Line Plus has 50 Newton meters of torque. And then the Performance Line, which has 65 Newton meters of torque. And this one is a little bit different. It's called the Performance Line Sport. And it's just a little bit different than the standard Performance Line. Really, one minor difference is that the top speed, this one can assist up to 28 miles an hour, but Bosch actually, communicates that it's not necessarily a true 28 mile an hour motor like their Performance Line Speed motor. Rather, it's just a motor that can assist past 20 miles an hour, and maybe for most people are going to feel like it tops out somewhere around 24, 25 miles an hour. But even though you can still get assistance up to 28. I think that makes sense. I mean, some people will say, well, why can't they just assist up to 28? I mean, they have that Performance Line Speed for that purpose. So the Performance Line Sport, what's this about? Who's it for? And why do they introduce this? One, I should note, it's important because I know a lot of you watch from many different places throughout the world. This will only be available in the US as well as New Zealand. I think it's just based on the regulations there. In other parts of the world, if you want a speed motor from Bosch, you're going to be looking at the Performance Line Speed. In some ways, this is a new version of the Generation 2 Performance Line Speed because it has kind of similar specs. I mean, this has a little bit more torque at 65 Newton meters, the same as the standard Generation 3 Performance Line. It has that higher top speed. In the US, it goes from 20 miles an hour to 28 miles an hour. In Europe, you still have the 15.5 miles an hour or 25 kilometers per hour. What's this thing about? I was fortunate to get to ride a bike with this motor system. Actually, check out a couple. There will be a few bikes, at least that I'm aware of right now, that are coming for 2021 with this motor system. And there are a few brands in particular that will be speccing this on their bikes. And one of the nice things with this motor is if the bike manufacturer already has a frame that can accommodate a Generation 3 motor, it's kind of simple enough for them to take this Performance Line Sport and add it to the bike, provided they feel like that bike can appropriately handle a higher speed motor specifically. From my side, there's a couple of brands I know that we're aware of that will spec this motor for 2021. One of them is Benno. Benno actually will have this on several of their bikes. So they'll have it on the Benno Boost, which is probably one of their most prominent bikes or most well known. They'll also have it on the E-Joy, the E-Scout, as well as the Remy Demi, which was a new bike for them this past year as well. And it's become pretty popular. So I think it's kind of cool to have these bikes that can go a little bit faster. Tern is also introducing a bike called the HSD S11. Many people have been asking for this bike, a bike that's compact and that can go fast. So Tern is kind of answering that call with this HSD S11. For some of you who might be familiar, the HSD was also released not too long ago, and that bike has historically been spec'd with a couple different motor systems depending on the model that you choose. You can get it with the Active Line Plus, the Performance Line, and now with the Performance Line Sport, which is pretty cool. Some other brands, Cannondale will have a few bikes with this motor on it as well. I should get more into what this motor is about, or what the experience is like, why it's different, why maybe somebody might want to choose a bike with this motor as opposed to the standard Performance Line, or maybe even as opposed to the standard Performance Line Speed. One, it's a little bit lighter than the Performance Line Speed. It's 6.3 pounds compared to 7.1 pounds. I believe the hardware is effectively the same as the standard Performance Line, so you're not really going to see much difference there in the ride characteristics or the handling. It's still going to have the same amount of torque at 65 Newton meters, which is just one step down from the highest torque levels that you'll see on the Generation 4 Bosch motors, whether it be the CX or the Performance Line Speed. Those have 85 Newton meters, so a good 25% more there. So where that really comes into play is if you have really big hills, if you're less fit of a rider, you might want to have that extra torque. But if you want to have like a little bit more of an active experience, you're not worried about getting the most amount of power out of your motor, this is probably a good way to go. And, I don't want to come across that this thing doesn't have plenty of power. I mean, most people found that standard performance line was pretty peppy, including myself. But there's some benefits to this in comparison to, say, like the Generation 4 motor. The Generation 4 motor, one, it's going to be slightly louder. This motor is nearly silent. And in my experience, the Generation 4 motor, you might have a little bit of noise initially, but usually it quiets down over time. And the reason being is you have metal gears inside the motor. So it's a metal gear on a metal gear. So it takes a little bit of time for that to break in order to kind of quiet down there. But this motor is nearly silent. The design is slightly different than the Generation 4 motor. But, over time, as you ride the Generation 4 for a little bit, it does quiet down. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that. But, definitely if you want the maximum amount of power, you probably want to consider going for a bike with the Generation 4 motor. Again, as I mentioned before, it's the same form factor as the Generation 3. So that'll fit on other Generation 3 bikes. So if I wanted to make some predictions on other bikes that might see this motor in the future, probably bikes that they might have, these manufacturers might have already developed with that motor system. If that makes sense, like these mounting points and the form factor, it just fits there. Where many people ask sometimes like, oh, can I put a Generation 4 motor on my bike if it didn't otherwise have that? No. And beyond that, also, most bike manufacturers won't really allow that. They're not really allowed to do that as far as their like liability, insurance, etc. So it gets a little bit complicated. I don't want to get too much into that right now, but just to think about. So quieter, really smooth assist. Maybe the Generation 4 might be a little bit more like punchy because it has a little bit more torque, but this is maybe intended to be a little bit more like gradual and like the onset and offset of power. Still, either way, I'd say, really from my experience, the Bosch motor system is like the smoothest out there. And I think it partly comes from their like sensing technology. It's really advanced and they really seem to know exactly like what you want when you want it. It's kind of interesting in that regard. I guess they put a lot of brains behind that sort of thing. 6.3 pounds. The performance line speed is 7.1 pounds, so a slight difference in weight there. I don't know if you necessarily would notice that on an e-bike, but something to consider. Assistance percentage, this kind of come up as a big thing in thinking about these different motors and how much assist you actually get. People often ask this. And this will assist up to 300%. Previously, the Generation 2 motor would assist up to 275% on the Max, like the CX motor. So the fact that this goes to 300% is a nice little upgrade there, while improving upon the design in some other ways, like with the removal of the reduction gear. So really easy to pedal without power. I think probably in comparing all the motors in the lineup, the Generation 3 system is probably the easiest to pedal without power. Not that there's a major difference between the Generation 3 and the Generation 4. Both of those don't have the reduction gear as you found in the Generation 2 motor. I might be getting too deep into these details at the moment. I don't want to kind of bore you with that so much. You're probably just wondering, like, is this relevant to me and would I want a bike with this motor on it? I'd say, like, if you're a sporty rider, you're looking to get some exercise, you don't want the bike to really fully take over. For one, that's generally the market for Bosch powered bikes or pedal assist bikes in general. The Generation 3 is kind of a bit more active, a bit more sporty in that way. And so I think if you were looking to participate more in the activity of pedaling, you might find that this one over, say, the Bosch Performance Line Speed might be a good fit. If you want something a little bit quieter, you might find that that's one of those notable differences there. Another notable detail is that this motor is a bit more efficient. It's particularly compared to the Generation 4 motor, which you have 85 Newton meters of torque. Naturally, with more torque, you're going to have a little bit more power output, and it's going to draw down the battery a little bit faster. So this is going to get you longer range from your battery, basically. But you can also kind of control that based on your assist level as well. So something to consider in that regard. Outside of that, people might be wondering, like, what's it compatible with? Here in the States, I mean, I think that we have to think about like what bikes are available and considering like, oh yeah, I want to get the Bosch Performance Line Sport with an internal hub and all this other sort of stuff. You might have trouble doing that because the reality is that there's not too many of them, at least for this year. Maybe we'll see more next year. It is a US and New Zealand specific motor system. So at the moment, it seems like these are mostly going to be available with derailleur style bikes, but in theory, this could work with the internal hub. It could work with all those other sort of options. It could work with basically all the options that Bosch has available on the market today, and that includes all the different displays, batteries, etc. So I think it's pretty cool. I'm pretty excited about it. So I did ride it, and as I mentioned before, I probably should talk just a bit more about the ride experience because I think that a lot of people would like to know what that's like. As I mentioned before, although it's classified as a 28 mile an hour or class 3 motor system, it will assist to 28, but really getting there, you're not getting quite as much assist, say past like 25 or so. It kind of starts dropping off there. I think that that's an important consideration. Like if you want like the fastest bike possible, probably looking at like a bike with the generation 4 speed motor would make more sense. But if you don't want to have that artificial limitation and just feel maybe more of your like natural limitation of riding the bike, I think that this makes a lot of sense. Actually, I don't know, I feel like I came up with this idea. I was actually talking with Benno about this, and he was like, you know, the natural limitation as opposed to the artificial limitation, because that's something you find or you might feel sometimes when you have like a 20 mile an hour assisted bike, or maybe in other places like a 15.5 mile an hour motor system. You might feel like somewhat artificially limited, like you hit 20 miles an hour and it's like, oh, I want to go faster, but you might feel like, you know, I wish I had assist past here. Where this, maybe you won't feel that as much. It's kind of a little bit more just natural. You just feel like it kind of gradually lets off. That's why I personally, I ride a speed bike a lot, and I generally find that maybe I'm riding more at like 23, 24 miles an hour when I'm just kind of cruising along. I'm not really like pushing myself hard. When I'm really pushing myself hard, I'm going 28, like a little, you know, I'm kind of just like teetering on the 28, 29 mile an hour, occasionally going above that if I'm really pushing myself. But at that point, I'm not getting an assist. So it is possible. You're definitely going to work for it. So it's thinking about those details. What do you really want out of the bike? But the other thing to consider, even though it doesn't go up to 28, or not easily for that matter, it's still considered class 3. And because it's class 3, or particularly I'm going to talk about just the US, I'm actually not that familiar with New Zealand exactly and the rules around that. But I know that in the US, the regulation around class 3, you might be limited on where you can ride it. There might be certain trails that you can't ride it. Class 3 bike, how and what the enforcement looks like on that, it's kind of different in all different regions. But it's something to consider. Say like, hey, you know what? I'm considering a bike with the 20 mile an hour or 28 mile an hour, and you should think about where you want to ride it. Can you do that legally? Or are you going to feel comfortable if you're doing something not legal? We definitely don't recommend that, but you know, just thinking about these things, just trying to be like reasonable and practical here. One of the benefit maybe of this system as opposed to the generation 4 speed motor, which you see I'm comparing these two quite a bit because those are the two most prominent speed motors in the Bosch lineup. They also have the cargo line speed, but it's not quite as popular. I think that's mostly what I wanted to cover on this. I hope you guys found this to be helpful. It's a bit of a different style of video for me. We're kind of changing it up. We'll be seeing some other changes as well. You might notice one in the background today, but I'll talk more about that later. And I look forward to seeing you guys in future videos. If you have any questions about this motor, you want to see some of the bikes that have this spec, we'll have some links in the description below. Also have some links to the video reviews, or you know, some more videos about those bikes if you want to find a bike with this new generation 3 Bosch Performance Line Sport motor. It's a pretty cool one. I think it'll be relatively popular for at least the bikes that it's available on. And yeah, hope you enjoyed this, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Well, see you soon.